Well, 30-some years ago, I did the first book I co-wrote with another journalist called Circle of Poison. And that book was essentially an expose of how when pesticides were banned in the United States, the companies would export them to developing countries. And then, of course, the chemicals would come back on the food that we eat. So we're eating the chemicals that have been banned here and poisoning the people in other countries. Now, 30 years goes by, and I've done a book, Exposed, which is about revealing about what happened in America when the European Union systematically began to ban chemicals because of their toxic impacts on human health. And those chemicals are still perfectly legal in the United States. So we have now we've gone from being the dumper, which we were 30 years ago, which has deep moral implications as well as health implications, to now being the company that's dumped on because our government has not shown the same focus on these threats as other governments. No, I mean, it's such a sad presumption that Americans have that their government is off testing chemicals that could damage their health. And I'm sorry to report that that is not the case. In fact, the U.S., back in the early 80s, passed a law, it's called the Toxic Substances Control Act, which was designed to ostensibly regulate toxic chemicals in circulation in the United States. But the deal that was cut to pass the law through Congress under intense industry pressure was to permit the chemicals that were already on the market to stay on the market without being tested. And so now we're talking like decades later, about 90% of the chemicals on the market today preceded the year of 1981. They've never been tested. And I think what that means is that every day Americans are exposed to an array of toxic substances that have actually never been tested for their toxicity. Although, number one, there's a huge amount we don't know about those thousands. We're talking about tens of thousands of chemicals. And number two, we have independent scientific assessments that's coming out of some of the major public health and scientific institutions in the world that are identifying the toxic nature of many of these substances, but the government does not have the power to act on them. So that's the situation we find ourselves in. I think the way to understand the impact of this situation is to think of ourselves as being the experimental mice in an experiment. And the experiment is essentially what is the effect of sustained exposure to toxic substances over time. For this experiment, there is really no control group outside of the United States. There is a control group, for example, in the European Union that has very different restrictions on these chemicals. But within the United States, we're all part of the experiment with no control group because we're all being exposed. And we are actually starting to see the results of this experiment. We're the rats in the experiment. Now we're seeing what the subjects of this experiment are coming up with. We see rising rates of cancer, rising rates of endocrine disorders, which many, many top scientists link to the sustained exposure over time to toxic chemicals. Well, the consequences on our health are registered in health clinics, hospitals, epidemiological surveys, in the form of rising rates of breast cancer, for example, which many scientists speculate have to do with the extreme presence of chemicals that are endocrine disruptors, that disrupt the endocrine system, which is essentially the nervous system of humans, or the active presence of actual carcinogens, suspected carcinogens, which are quite amazingly common in our world. So we are seeing the effects of this kind of toxic exposure in numerous settings, in rising rates of cancer. There's been speculation as to the declining rates of sperm in American men, meaning numbers of sperm, per test, has been declining pretty. It's in a steady decline over the last several decades. And one of the seriously grounded theories about why that's happening is because of the sustained exposure to chemicals that impact the reproductive system of men. And so when we think of this experiment that we're undergoing, we are subjecting ourselves to an array of toxic substances, and we're finding out what the results are. Now, what's interesting is that in the European Union, which has now banned chemicals that are strongly suspected of being carcinogenic or mutagenic, we are beginning to see, it's been about roughly 10 years since the banning of those kind of substances in the European Union. And so initial evidence, I can't say it's yet decisive, but initial evidence suggests that these kind of conditions linked to chemical exposure are showing signs of decline. We won't know for sure, for it could take 20, 30 years to know for sure, because it takes a while for these substances to build up in the tissue. But one thing is very clear that we know, which is that if you were to do blood tests, well, this has been done, kind of randomized blood tests of Americans done by the Center for Disease Control of the United States, they are finding kind of levels of substances that are carcinogenic, mutagenic, reproductive toxins, endocrine disruptors, are essentially in every American's bloodstream. And so the question of our exposure and our integration of these chemicals into our bodies is clear. Now the question is, what do we do about it? Well, I've been wondering, when I wrote Exposed, the book Exposed, and in the book Exposed I describe both the scientific evidence for the toxic impacts of a broad array of chemicals that we encounter on a routine basis. So it's the science. I also write about the different responses of the same science, the different responses of the European governments to the American government. So you have the same science. And in many cases, the European government policymakers were actually studying the results of American scientists who produce science, and science is an international field. People read each other's articles. And so many of the European policymakers were reading the science of both Europeans and Americans, as well as others, Chinese and Brazilians, and coming to a completely different conclusion than the American policymakers. The European Union went about determining to actually test those tens and tens of thousands of chemicals that have never been tested in the United States. The European Union has begun testing them with the suspected worst ones first, and they're making their way through the list, and systematically beginning to ban those that are really shown as being harmful, as the United States has actually done close to nothing during that period. And so I did ask the question to myself, I later wrote about it in Exposed, the book Exposed, why this different approach? And I talked to many people, I read a lot, and I think there's actually, if you want one answer, there is a different there's different political culture in Europe than, of course, here in the United States. But in terms of the one most significant factor, healthcare. The European governments pay for their citizens' healthcare. If you go to Germany or Britain or France or Denmark or Spain, you have healthcare. And the healthcare is, for the most part, free. It's funded through, people pay taxes and there's all sorts of mechanisms for funding essentially what is a universal healthcare for people, and it's a very high quality healthcare. It's certainly comparable to that in the United States. And now if you're a government that's paying for the health care of your citizens, you have a vested interest in ensuring that they are healthy, because the last thing you want them to do is come down with some condition that's going to throw them into the hospital and take treatment over time and over many weeks, months, expensive medicines, et cetera, et cetera. So I think one of the main motives for the much more aggressive European approach has been the cost of health care and the desire and the seeing that in one place. So here in America, our healthcare system is fractured. It's even the government support for the healthcare system is highly controversial. Each state has a very different approach. On the one hand, so an American can look at the healthcare system and say, oh boy, this is complicated. How do we deal with all these kind of the insurance companies and the private interests over here? And over there, oh yeah, that other side over there is you got all these crazy toxic chemicals, as if these are unrelated, which is a complete illusion that these things are unrelated. And so I think the fact that the European governments actually are responsible for their citizens' health care had a huge impact in giving them motive to begin this process. And I followed the debate over some of the laws that the Europeans passed when it came to toxics. And repeatedly, in addition to what many felt were an obligation of a government to protect its citizens, was the cost of not protecting them. Billions and billions and billions of dollars. Even the top medical associations in Europe endorsed this measure. The top nursing associations all endorsed this because the cost to the government was starting to skyrocket. And that was one of the very powerful arguments. There are other factors in terms of the different political systems, but if you want one major contributor, I think that is why we have different systems. Okay, well, when we talk about CMRs, it's a C, it's an M, it's an R. It sounds like a horrible acronym. But a CMR is carcinogen, mutagen, reproductive toxin. So let's go through what each one of those are. Carcinogen means it's a chemical that is suspected of causing cancer or helping to trigger cancer. An M is a mutagen, which means it's suspected of causing mutations in the offspring of mothers who are exposed to certain substances. This means birth defects of various forms. R is the reproductive toxin, which means it damages the reproductive system of males and females in different ways. So the CMRs are pretty potent substances. And it turns out they're all over the place in American cosmetics. How do we know that they're all over the place? Because there's no law requiring that the cosmetic companies inform people if there is a C, an M, or an R in their cosmetics. The reason we know how many of these substances are in the cosmetics is because the European Union passed a law saying that they required, and that the requirement began, I believe it was around in 2006 or 2007, that the cosmetic companies needed to report if they had carcinogens, mutagens, or reproductive toxins, and then the EU could determine whether they should take them out. And so all this information came flooding into the EU authorities, and suddenly these things are cosmetics which are internationally traded. We suddenly knew because the EU was demanding it and required that they take the bulk of them out. So then, because these cosmetic companies are basically international companies, we know that they have them in Europe, and they also have them in the United States. That's why we know that there are CMRs in American cosmetics, because they were forced to take them out in Europe. And what that led to was a whole spate of examples where cosmetics sold without the chemicals in Europe are sold with the chemicals in the United States. And now, that said, I would say that most that I'm aware of the big name cosmetic companies, compelled to take the chemicals out of their European line of cosmetics, also took them out of the American line. So it took a couple of years to work its way through the system, but I think it's a reasonable bet that if it's an international company that also has a strong presence in Europe, that those cosmetics would not contain the chemicals banned in Europe. But if you're talking about a kind of a no-name or low-name recognition company that might be imported from some other place, and this is obviously gets to a big, profound question of equity, because often the lower expensive cosmetics come from places like China or elsewhere that are much cheaper. They are and they can sell cosmetics to Americans. They don't sell to Europeans. They don't bother exporting to Europeans because they can't get them into the country, but they sell to Americans. And so if you're talking about one of these cosmetics that actually comes from a company you don't really know, and it's not really international, it's imported from someplace other than Europe, there's a reasonable chance that there are carcinogens, mutagens, or reproductive toxins in there. Now, why does this exist? The reason it exists is because back in the this really goes way back, but anyway, back in the previous century, I believe it was the 30s, could be the 20s or 30s, when the FDA was created, the Food and Drug Administration. One of the concessions made to the cosmetic companies was that the FDA would be excluded from regulating the ingredients of cosmetics. So again, it was a deal cut with the industry at that time, which was a much smaller industry than it is today, with the cosmetic companies, which said, we don't want you looking into the ingredients we use. And they had their congressmen and their congress people to ensure that that provision was put in there. And that has not changed. And every time there's been an attempt to change it, including some efforts even as far back as the 70s, even into the 80s, 90s, there have been congressional efforts to change it. The cosmetic companies, personal care companies have fought it in Congress and stopped that from happening. So the point of all this is that chemicals that are literally banned from cosmetics in Europe, in products that people, mostly women, but not only, people use every single day. We're talking about everything from eyeshadow to lipstick to mascara to skin powder to shampoos and nail polish. If they don't have some connection to the European Union, could contain all sorts of toxic substances. And the sad thing about that is twofold. One is that it exists, that there's no American body that cared enough about our health that said, like, stop, we're gonna take this stuff out. And two, it strikes directly at the equity question, because of course if you have the resources to buy the more expensive cosmetics, the bets are reasonable that they don't contain this, because by accident, lucky you, you're protected by the Europeans. But if you don't have those resources, you buy your cosmetics at a lower cost place, there is no guarantee whatsoever that they don't contain this material. So when we're talking phthalates, the phthalates are a substance that enables plastic to be kind of more malleable, and it actually is a plastic additive, and it's included in many things, including toys for kids, dashboards of cars, many different kind of objects have bottles have had phthalates, and it's been found to be a very profound endocrine disrupting chemical. So the European Union began looking at the data related to phthalates, and in 2006, let's just say around a decade ago, determined that the amounts that a child would be exposed to in the course of playing around with a ball or a little toy that had phthalates in it was dangerous enough to ban the use of phthalates in children's toys. And so the EU set about to ban the use of phthalates, and as a way to protect the evolving endocrine system of children, which are extremely sensitive and more vulnerable to these contaminants than even we adults. The phthalates are the one example where the U.S. government actually took the lead from the European Union and went ahead and actually, a couple of years after the EU acted, the U.S. Congress passed a law which actually banned the use of phthalates in products for children under the age of 5 for this very reason. So in this case, the U.S. took the lead from the European Union, followed that lead, followed their analysis, and it was so egregious and so bad, and mothers were rather upset, as you might imagine, that their kids would be exposed to this stuff, that we do have a ban on the use of phthalates in goods for children 5 and under, which is, I suppose you could say, an accomplishment of environmental health success story. I think it's also just to keep in mind that how far behind the United States has been, that actually we had to follow up this other initiative by the Europeans to actually ban this. But thankfully we have banned it. Phthalates are still in a whole array of products, but they are not in children's toys. The Consumer Product Safety Commission did an amazing study of children's behavior. They were studying whether phthalates would be dangerous enough to ban, and they watched children play with their toys through one of these kind of one-way mirror things, and realized that the average kid left alone in a room will like play with phthalate-laden toys for like hours a day. And I think at first there was a lot of resistance in the U.S. to banning phthalates, but I think in the end the experience of seeing children exposing themselves to phthalates was enough to shake even the most congressperson, the most beholden to the chemical industry. Well, that one could say that you are dealing with a very powerful reproductive toxin, and there have been studies, and I don't know if you want to go into this, but that actually correlate the phthalate exposure of a woman to the size and functions of a male penis when they're born. This, and I'm not just saying this out of thin air. This comes out of a top public health researcher at the University of Rochester by somebody who's testified now in Congress and at the state health department in California. So there are serious concerns about the absorption of this through the placenta, and still very much an active question as to adults who are exposed. Well, the American Chemistry Council represents the American chemical industry. They have had an enormous influence on the state of American chemical laws. I described this in my book, Exposed. Their influence goes back decades and decades and decades. The chemical industry is one of the biggest contributors to congressional campaigns of all the industries that contribute. They've actually succeeded in, we have this law, the Toxic Substance Control Act, which has allowed some 90,000 chemicals to be grandfathered onto the American market without any testing at all. And every time a congressperson tries to strengthen the law, the chemical industry makes sure their influence is felt through massive campaign donations. So pretty much most efforts to reform that system have been stymied as a result of the chemical industry's lobbying force. They have succeeded in setting up a system that is so old-fashioned and ancient and creaking and unresponsive to new information that despite all the incredible advances in the environmental health sciences over the past decades, the United States has only succeeded in banning, well, number one, there's only 5 chemicals that are banned in the whole United States. And not one of them has actually been banned since 1990. So for 27, 28 years, while the evidence of toxicity has accumulated mightily, mountains of evidence developing around a whole array of substances, that evidence has, there's been no mechanism within the EPA to actually act on that evidence. And that's the same evidence that has been acted on by the European Union regulators. The European Union, which has its own chemical industry, by the way, I mean, they have a strong chemical industry. They do have very powerful lobbying of the Parliament and the EU institutions. What they don't have is a campaign finance system like we have here in the United States. And there is also a different mechanism for regulating chemicals in the EU, and that is called the Precautionary Principle. And according to the Precautionary Principle, the government is empowered to act based on the accumulation of evidence about the potential harm of a substance. So as you start seeing mounting evidence of actual harm, the EU makes the calculation that it's going to be better to prevent potential harm rather than waiting for absolute perfect scientific certainty about the dangers of a particular substance. In the United States, the level of certainty is very high. They essentially requires like near certainty. And anybody about dangers, and anybody who understands science knows that certainty does not exist. There is no certainty in science. There is always an interplay of different studies, different analyses. And so reaching that bar in the United States has been made impossible by this requirement, which was largely written at the behest of the chemical industries, because they know that this is a bar that's impossible to meet, which is why we have not banned a chemical in the face of monumental evidence for 27 years and have only succeeded in banning 5, whereas the European Union has a whole other approach. Carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive toxins banned, taken out of circulation. And so this is one of the fundamental distinctions. And the last thing I want to add about the difference between the United States and the European Union, because the industry in America argues that to put restrictions on chemical production will impinge on their financial success and will cost jobs and will create financial pressures on these industries. So in my book, Exposed, I actually examined that assertion, and I said, okay, how's the chemical industry doing in this situation where all these chemicals are banned? And in fact, their rates of profits are either stable or rising. No chemical company has come close to feeling economic contraction. As opposed to what they were doing is innovating. They were coming up with new chemicals to actually adapt to these circumstances, whereas American chemical companies have not innovated because there's no mandate that requires them or that compels them to innovate. So in a sense, American chemical companies are just producing the same chemicals over and over and over again that are both dangerous and grandfathered in, whereas European chemical companies are far more at the forefront of coming up with less toxic alternatives. There's another point about the impact of this disharmony between the American and European approach, and that is that in the United States, we've imagined ourselves as being at the forefront of these kind of questions. And it used to be that the United States was the model for environmental regulations. But now, some of the developing countries, rapid developing countries, Brazil, China, Korea, Mexico, are looking for their new set of environmental contaminant regulations. They're not looking to the United States anymore. They're looking to the European Union. So instead of sending their new environment minister to Washington, D.C. to figure out what the Americans are up to and trying to meet our standards, they're instead flying right over the head and going straight to Brussels and dealing with the and trying to bring their standards up to the European Union standards. So what this means geopolitically is not only is the American stance a threat to our health, it's also undermining the American position around the world. The effect on the food supply of climate change is already happening. The notion that it's some abstract kind of period in the future is really a deep misunderstanding of, I'm afraid to report, of what's already occurring in farm fields across the world, because there are a number of phenomena that are occurring simultaneously. Well, let me put it another way. Heat rises, as we know. The temperature is rising all across the earth, and that includes in some of the most important food-growing lands across the planet. At the same time, the patterns of rainfall are being dramatically altered. And what that means is that the rain is not falling in the patterns that it used to. In fact, it's breaking all sorts of pattern records. Scientists have determined that you can no longer predict the future in terms of rainfall based on past patterns. They've actually gone back thousands of years of hydrological history and determined that basically now we've reached a point, and now being in the last essentially 10 to 15 years, when they're actually really noticing this profound shift, that the past patterns of rainfall, the past patterns of variation in the rainfall are completely out of sync with what we're experiencing now. So now we have high volatility when it comes to rain. Generally speaking, less rain is falling when it used to, and more rain is falling in intensive downpours, which actually lead both to floods, but also lead to the kind of inundation of crops that are not accustomed to getting this kind of level of water at one time. So what we're seeing is high stresses on the agricultural system in regions across the world. For those two factors, conditions, water, heat, and third, the things that follow those conditions, which are new diseases and new pests that are following those new conditions. So pests that used to be limited to the south of the United States, for example, meaning in Mexico or Central America, are moving into the southwest of the United States, even as far as the Midwest, because it's getting warmer. Bugs that used to be killed off by the onset of winter are surviving because it gets cold later. Some tree crops that need for it to get cold in the December, for example, in California, cherries and other tree crops need to get cold in December in order to slow down their metabolism so that 3 or 4 months later they can come bursting forth with all those delicious fruits and flowers, which we happen to see. We love the cherry flowers. Well, it turns out it's not getting cold enough to actually retract so that the yields on those cherries and the qualities of the cherries in California, which is where I'm from, is depleting, as well as in the other tree fruits. So already in the Central Valley of the United States, in the Midwest of the United States, in the Dakotas of the United States, elsewhere in the world, Southwest China, big food growing area of China, Northern Africa, big food growing area for North Africa and the Middle East, Southern Europe, Italy, Southern France. They're all feeling these pressures, which means yields are declining, and this is a situation that the world is facing now. We know what it's about. It's only going to accentuate until we find a way to actually grow crops differently, grow different types of seeds than we currently rely on. The hidden costs of climate change are so massive, and they're in so many different sectors of society that it just takes an understanding of how to understand the basic phenomena of climate change to actually then begin to comprehend where the hidden costs are. So you have a record-setting pace of extreme events like hurricanes. Right here in Long Island, we have, where I am right now, you have the extreme events of hurricanes. Hurricane Sandy, which was devastating, cost tens and tens of billions of dollars to the government to help homeowners and citizens to reestablish themselves. Now, what's important is nobody claims that climate change caused Hurricane Sandy. That is not the case. We've always had hurricanes. We've always had tornadoes. We've always had many other natural disasters. What is clear, according to the evidence and according to what the scientists tell us, is that when a hurricane happens, it is going to be far more intense than it would have been without these climatic alterations. What's happening in the atmosphere is getting saturated with more and more carbon dioxide. It's holding the heat closer to the Earth. It can't respire as this kind of organism, Earth as an organism respiring. And so that creates enormous imbalance in the atmosphere, which leads to more intense storms, more intense rainfall and sporadic bursts. And that accentuates the damage, the heightened damage from extreme events. So one way to think of the hidden costs of climate change are the amount of money we have to spend to help people recover from those extreme events. You have Hurricane Sandy here. You have Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, tens of billions of dollars. The California drought, which has cost billions and billions of dollars. You have the crop insurance ratios that have been skyrocketing. Crop insurance payouts by the publicly supported crop insurance system, supported by us taxpayers, has been skyrocketing, practically doubled over the years between 2010 and 2020 in the billions and billions of dollars. And the USDA, our own U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is not exactly some radical bomb-throwing eco-radical organization, ascribes a large portion of those costs to climate change. The USDA did before the current administration, during the Obama administration. It's very clear. So that is a hidden cost. Have you ever thought about crop insurance as a consequence of climate change that you are paying? Because we pay into the U.S. government, the U.S. government pays out to farmers. Countless consequences of climate change amounting essentially hundreds of billions of dollars. The Navy now considers climate change a major threat to its infrastructure. Even in counter to the Trump administration's position on climate change, which is a non-position, which is a climate denial administration. But the Pentagon, which actually has to have a realistic eye on the conditions of the Earth. The Defense Department has to understand the world as it is, not as it would like it to be, not infused by some ideological desire system. And so now the Pentagon, in conflict, in contrast to the president, is saying that climate change continues to present a major threat both to its infrastructure, but also as a national security threat because of the increased flow of migrants who can no longer sustain themselves on land that is being altered by climate change, for example, in Mexico and Central America. And in Europe, it's a similar concern, although it's not the Pentagon, it's the European version of the Pentagon sees this is a big national security question. So the cost, for example, of the cost for adapting naval facilities that are based on coastlines amounts to billions and billions of dollars, which now the Pentagon even acknowledges is a result of climate change. There's another hidden cost. So the reason why it's important to acknowledge the hidden costs of climate change, which is the subject of my book, The End of Stationarity, and I talk about all the multiple levels of hidden cost of climate change in that book. For the most part, when we engage in this discussion about climate change, about a consideration of what to do, how to respond to climate change, there's this false sense, I think, of we have the status quo here, which costs X, Y, Z. We pay our taxes, costs the government, costs businesses, costs individuals X to just maintain the status quo. But if we were to act on climate change by reorganizing the grid, by shifting our power sources to more renewable sources, et cetera, we would be having to pay this, which creates this illusion that it's more expensive to actually face climate change, when in fact, these costs right here have been hidden for years, and they come up much closer to the actual cost of dealing with climate change. So it's very important to realize the actual, real impacts financially as well as physically of climate change, acknowledge those costs, and then make an informed decision. And that's what my book, The End of Stationarity, is about, is identifying what those costs are and how we can deal with them. Climate change is a national security issue for the United States, identified by the United States Department of Defense, which lists climate change as one of the top national security challenges to the United States. And this, by the way, includes the current Department of Defense, current being 2018, in which the Department of Defense has taken a very different position on climate change than the President of the United States. The President, as most people know, is a climate denier. He has chosen not to respond to the evidence that is mountainous by now, and for his own ideological reasons. The Pentagon, which has to actually follow the world as it is, and these are professionals in defending the United States, and they have to see where the threats actually lie. Not where they want them to lie, but where they actually lie. And they have identified now for the past several years that climate change is one of the major security threats for a number of different reasons. Number one is the threat it presents as a physical threat to the military installations themselves, which are facing increasing flooding and inundation, particularly ones on the coast, and there are a lot, particularly in the U.S. Navy. Two is the threat that it presents to the borders of the United States, because the United States is bordered, particularly on the southern border, on Mexico and Central America, and that we could be facing increasing waves of migrants who can no longer sustain themselves on land that has been dramatically, the conditions of which have been dramatically altered by climate change. So they see the immigration flow not from a politically loaded or ideological point of view, but as just something the U.S. has to face and has to deal with, this idea that people are getting dislocated from their land and may be compelled to move north. And they also see that basically the struggle for resources in countries that even have less ability to respond to climate change will intensify in places, for example, that are experiencing serious stresses of water or serious heat increases. There's a lot of thinking now that the conflict in Syria, in addition to having its roots in a brutal dictatorship that ruled for many, many years, people's response to that, there was also a long-standing drought in Syria, which really actually put a huge damper on the ability to grow food in Syria, which created extra tensions in a country where power was so skewed that if you were connected to the government, you got food. If you weren't connected to the government, it was more difficult to get food, created the tensions that led to this explosive and brutal situation, which has actually drawn the United States into that conflict. So the Pentagon sees these links that scientists all over the world have been identifying. And I think if we don't act on climate change, we're going to see these links to our national security intensify. There are health benefits from organic agriculture. Basically, you don't have chemicals that you're consuming. So that is important alone for organic agriculture. But put it in the climate context. What's interesting about the numerous studies now have been done, as well as numerous farmers can tell you this, but also I think there's a lot of accumulating evidence that organic farmers put a lot of organic material into the soil. Either they put it or they find ways to replenish the soil in terms of how they rotate their crops and how the crops that they grow. They don't rely on chemical fertilizers to nourish their crops. And they rely on organic material in the soil to nourish their crops. And they are not using chemicals that deplete the soil of organic material. So there are two reasons why that's important. One is this kind of material is much better at absorbing water. So water falls from the sky, and rather than kind of running off on these kind of hard, rigid surfaces that many of the industrial scale agriculture has, it gets absorbed into the soil, and which means that the crops can actually, when a drought hits, there's water in the soil that they can rely on if the rain doesn't come. There's another reason why that's important, is that numerous studies now have looked at before and after a natural disaster, whether it's a hurricane or a flood or some other nightmare scenario. And they've found that farms that are rich in organic material and that are diverse within the fields are far more resilient to ecological traumas, like a major extreme event is, than the kind of large monoculture industrial farms that rely on chemicals. One after another, after another, after another, studies are showing essentially that the farms that bounce back quicker are the ones that are organic, or that rely on organic material in the soil to sustain themselves and also replenish the soil of minerals and other nutrients in a kind of cycle that most organic farmers are very attuned to. So aside from being beneficial from a health point of view, it's been found that actually farms that utilize these techniques are much more resilient. And in fact, the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, on the latter days of the Obama administration, determined that using those kind of techniques can actually be a preferable way to grow food. So basically, the USDA issued a series of guidelines in the latter year and a half of the Obama administration. And the guidelines were very much like we need farms that are more rich with organic material, that have a much more diverse array of seeds, because those are the kind of farms that are going to be longer lasting. And it was very interesting to see that come out of the USDA, which has been a big supporter of kind of big industrial ag for a long time. That is, of course, not really the case anymore with the current administration, but I think as a principle, it's very important to remember that that happened, and those guidelines remain, if not enforced, they remain recommendations of a USDA that existed previous to the current change of administration, which has, needless to say, taken a very different view of organic agriculture. At least we got a precedent, we got a baseline. And a lot of people read that. I mean, I think there's actually an enormous amount happening in the world around new forms of agriculture. There's an incredible movement of people to defend their seeds and to actually utilize seeds that grow in their own regions. They're very adaptable seeds that are able to kind of respond to the changes in environmental conditions. There's a movement essentially across this country and across the world to retain those seeds and actually defy this idea of chemical seed companies producing seeds that are going to be grown over thousands of acres if you just use enough chemicals. There is a movement afoot to actually defy that trend, to utilize seeds that have adapted in particular circumstances, and utilize the techniques of organic agriculture to create more adaptable farms. And I think that's a pretty exciting development when it comes to the food, both in creating a stable and steady source of food in a very volatile time. I think the principles drawn from the organic agriculture experience are getting to be not only more important for we the public, but also more recognized by the people who study this, who are scientists, agricultural scientists, who are saying this is a long-term strategy for food security. Well, this is this incredible series of revelations that have come out over the last couple of years about, for example, Exxon, biggest oil company, dating back to the late 70s, had scientists going out to different parts of the world to actually study the impact of accumulating CO2 in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases, and started seeing what the effects were. And we're reporting back to corporate headquarters in Texas that this greenhouse gas effect could actually start disrupting natural systems on the earth. And that in fact, Exxon sponsored some of the most kind of far-seeing science back in those days, 70s and 80s now, and reporting back home as a way of alerting management to potential threats to the dominion of oil, so they can begin to deal with that situation. And the management at ExxonMobil, it was Exxon then, now it's ExxonMobil, apparently integrated the thinking into their internal processes and simultaneously denied to the public. And so you had a situation where the oil company itself knew what the impact of its product was, but it did not share it with the public. And it turns out to be, need I remind you, it is not illegal to lie to the public. It is, however, illegal to lie to your shareholders. So, in essence, Exxon is now facing serious legal challenges from the Attorney General of New York, as well as other places, because it was clearly aware of a risk posed by climate change, but publicly continued to deny the risk repeatedly. Not only did Exxon deny the risks publicly, but they funded these institutions that promoted this kind of climate denialist perspective for years. So a lot of the institutions that have continuously questioned climate science were funded by Exxon as well as other oil companies who made these completely specious arguments against the climate science. So, in fact, there's an extra added dose of just of poignancy to the fossil fuel companies' role in contributing to climate change, at the same time knowing what the impacts were and keeping them actively secret, lying not only to the public, but actually to their own owners, who are the shareholders, who are now rather angry with the company. So Exxon now faces serious legal liability because of this question, which is also raising a lot of questions about the tenure of our current Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who of course used to be the CEO of Exxon during this period, part of this period that was in which the company was sponsoring science tonight, and on the one hand, and denying to the public on the other. And he may very well be called to testify at one of the lawsuits. So it's another example, essentially, of the duplicity that we've faced when it comes to the fossil fuel companies. They know what the consequence of their product is, but they're trying to actually extract as much oil, get as many profits as possible before the regulations really come down. And of course, now we have a delay in that. First of all, let's identify what we're talking about when we talk about a price for carbon. We're already paying a price for carbon. It's just not called that. When you had to rebuild here in Sandy, we were paying the costs of the climate change contribution to that storm. I don't want to get overly scientific here, but there's a body of evidence that suggests that that storm, for example, was at least 20% more intense and more violent than it would have been otherwise if there hadn't been climate change. That 20% could have meant the difference of having your home inundated or not inundated, or your roof taken off or not taken off. And so there's billions of dollars we're paying just like that. And similar calculations with Hurricane Katrina, similar calculations with the floods that have been ravaging the Midwest during the after intense rain events, rocketing crop insurance payouts to farmers who lose their crops because it's getting too hot, they're not getting enough water. And in that case, identified clearly by the USDA as a consequence of climate change. We taxpayers pay into those funds, and the incidence of billion-dollar events, meaning billion-dollar events that cost $1 billion and more to recover from, have been accelerating and reaching kind of record-breaking levels. So we are already paying a cost for carbon, carbon as a stand-in for climate change. So it's a little bit of a ruse to say, oh, well, we've got, should we start paying a price for carbon or not? Well, the not is an illusion because we're already paying that cost. So the question is really who pays the cost and when do we pay it? The idea of a cost on carbon is basically associated with the idea of either a carbon tax, I know it's a horrible word, or a price for carbon in the marketplace, which would be a carbon market. And either way, you actually have the same impact. The impact is that for every quantity of greenhouse gas, for every ton of greenhouse gas produced, there's some kind of money that's paid up front for that pollution in order to create a fund to respond to the climatic disruptions that are occurring. And so, yes, I think there needs to be a upfront cost for carbon as opposed to a masked, disguised, masquerade cost of carbon, which exists in all these other ways. And if we were to actually begin to see the costs up front of greenhouse gas pollution, number one, it's a more accurate and honest way to understand the effects of this pollution. And two, it's a more honest, accurate, and direct way to push companies towards moving away from fossil fuels. Because if you have to pay for it, you basically will start thinking about other ways to do it. So there are numerous ways to do that. I happen to think that a carbon tax is probably more direct, but a carbon market, where I live in California, we have a carbon market where the big oil companies have to pay for the right to pollute. And it has not driven the oil companies out of the state. It has not driven the car companies out of the state. It's actually provided billions of dollars to the state of California to adapt to climate change, to create coastal infrastructures, to create incentives for farmers to do less greenhouse gas intensive cropping systems, to plant more trees to absorb carbon dioxide, which they do. And California now has one of the fastest growing economies in the United States of America. So the idea of paying for carbon, which we are doing, I live in California, has certainly not had any economic contraction. Here in the Northeast, you're paying sort of a price for carbon through the kind of system that ascribes a penalty to fossil fuel utilities. And there are no indications that I have been able to see, and nobody's been able to provide me with any indications that either the Northeast approach or the California approach has the impact of contracting the economy. This is very important because when we hear the debate over a cost for carbon, we always hear how it's going to cost jobs and it's going to lead to an economic contraction. But very much like chemicals, when we talk about taking chemicals out of circulation, the chemical companies argue, no, it's going to cost jobs, it's going to cost profit levels. Doesn't happen when you do it because you can see it happening in other places and the chemical companies face no consequence. Similarly, in the world, in the places where there has been an aggressive cost for carbon, relatively aggressive, which is the European Union, state of California, and to some degree the Northeast states, there has been no economic contraction as a result of this happening. Instead, there's been a funneling of money to actually respond to these climatic conditions, help create an energy grid that's more, that can utilize the renewable energy sources. And what it does mean is a shifting of resources. So there is a shift that occurs when you put a price for carbon, and that is this, which is that money does move from the fossil fuel intensive businesses, which could be trucking, which could be gas stations. You can't deny that there's money that moves from there to other sectors, whether it's solar or wind power. Every study that's been done does not show a net loss of jobs. What it does show is a shift in jobs. So basically you go from actually having, a number of people whose livelihoods are tied up in fossil fuel industries, putting aside the CEOs and they'll do fine. People who are working for basic livelihood in whether it's trucking or retail gas outlets or other things that use intensive fossil fuel energy. The basic ideas of putting a price for carbon usually include some ability to retrain some of those workers. And I think that's a very important principle. You have to make this adjustment. We've been sending money in this direction towards fossil fuel reliant people. We need to kind of shift those resources, and I think with this kind of a cost for carbon, you can actually do that and have no economic contraction, which I would reiterate, there is no evidence to suggest that the places that have imposed a price for carbon have shown an economic contraction. That includes, like I said, California, New England, European Union, some provinces of Canada like British Columbia, all have a price already. And let me make one final point, because it's very important to remember the new carbon market that is coming online to the world this year, now unfolding. China. China now has the second largest carbon market in the world, next to the European Union, China, California. So China has started this whole program. It's now been in the works for several years, and it's now starting really formally now to actually charge the major fossil fuel producers, they're basically the utilities, to start paying a cost for greenhouse gas pollution. And so the argument that by somehow putting a cost for greenhouse gas pollution on American companies would put us at a disadvantage in relation to China is a complete ruse and is totally inaccurate, because the Chinese are starting to set up their own costs because they understand what climate change is doing to the world. And so the principle of preparing for and dealing with the realities of climate change is dawning on the world's major economic engines. And I hope that the United States itself as a nation does not lag too far behind the rest of the world. Amidst all these kind of very disturbing signs of environmental stress in this country and around the world, there's incredible energy out there. People are recognizing what the threat is. They are acting all over the world. In this country, huge knowledge of what the impacts of climate change are. People are taking actions. The business community is getting very, very, very involved in finding ways to actually reduce their own carbon footprints. The renewable energy industry has been growing at a very rapid rate, completely outpacing the old fossil fuel industries. So you have booms in wind, solar power, even in deeply politically conservative states like Texas, Iowa, boom times in wind energy because it makes economic sense as well as ecological sense. So there's an enormous amount of energy happening as people respond to the very real pressures that they see. You also see it in the farming community, among farmers who are actually beginning to realize that, number one, the techniques of producing food that produce a lot of greenhouse gases are not necessarily the most efficient or the most long-lasting or the most sustainable than food growing that is less ecologically destructive and greenhouse gas producing. So while the information is actually quite sobering, I've spent quite a bit of time now documenting both what the problems are, which are significant, but also have come to realize and come to see the extraordinary spectrum of action that's taking place from local to city to state levels. Actually, cities across the United States are actually turning out to be at the forefront of action when it comes to climate change, taking measures to reduce carbon footprints, to encourage the use of renewable energy. And even as our federal government moves in the opposite direction, cities, states, and businesses are moving quickly. And so I would say that there is that we are not operating in one kind of bad news vacuum. There's actually enormous kind of responses to across the spectrum from individuals, governments, and business too.